Good morning, everybody. Salam, صبح همگی بخیر. My name is Nima Khorramroz. I'm a linguist and a language tutor, and I work for the Virtual Persian Academy. Before I turn the floor to our distinguished speaker, I wish to take just a few minutes to let you know how this webinar will work. First of all, it's lovely to see all of you here, and I wish to thank you all for supporting this webinar, and thank you so very much for your participation. This is the first of a series of webinars that the Virtual Persian Academy is organizing. So with this in mind, and on behalf of the Virtual Persian Academy's headmistress, Mrs. Rosa Rasti, I wish to thank our distinguished speaker for accepting our invitation and for being with us today. Before we get any further, I've just got some basic Zoom housekeeping. Number one, please keep yourself on mute throughout this presentation webinar so we don't get any background noises from your end. And number two, please note that the chat box is disabled, meaning that you cannot use the chat box throughout the webinar. We're suggesting that people write their questions on a piece of paper and ask them at the end of the webinar. As I've said this before, the webinar will be followed by the Q&A, by the questions and answer session, so you will have this opportunity to ask your questions at the end of the webinar. When it comes time for questions, you can just physically raise your hand, or you can use the raised hand widget tool, which you'll find on your dashboard. And so then I will say your name, you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your questions. As I've said this before, this webinar is being recorded. The recording of the webinar will be available on the Virtual Persian Academy's website, www.virtualpersianacademy.co.uk. So I guess you can then watch this in your spare time, and you can pass over this recording to your peers and colleagues so then they can watch it in their spare times too. And this brings me to the interesting part, which is the introductory part. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me to finally introduce today's speaker, Dr. Julio Villagarcia, who is going to talk to us about the blessing of bilingualism. This is a subject in which I personally think we should all be deeply interested, because we are living in a multicultural and multilingual world. So to provide you with a little bit of background information on Julio's academic life, Julio was born in Spain. He gained his BA, his bachelor degrees in English studies from the University of Oviedo in 2005. He then earned his master degrees in linguistics from the University of Essex in 2007, and his second master in the same discipline from the University of Connecticut in 2010. Julio obtained his PhD from the same institution in 2012. From 2012 to 2015, he worked as an assistant professor of Spanish linguistics at Villanova University. From 2015 to 2020, Julio worked as a lecturer in Spanish linguistics and syntax at the University of Manchester. From 2020 to 2022, he worked as a senior lecturer in Spanish linguistics and syntax, linguistics and English language at the University of Manchester. Since the beginning of 2022, Julio has been a Maria Zambrona Research Scholar in the Theoretical Linguistics Group at the University of Oviedo. During his PhD, Julio was trained as, please unmute yourself. During his PhD, Julio was trained as a syntactician. His current interests lie in the areas of Spanish, Romance, and English linguistics. Other interests include bilingualism and the application of theoretical linguistics research to foreign and second language pedagogy. Julio has presented widely on a host of topics in syntax and its variation and acquisition, alongside engagement and knowledge transfer topics such as multilingualism, as well as the benefits of applying the scientific method to the teaching and learning of foreign languages. In 2019, he gave a talk at TEDx on why bilingualism is so natural, which can be watched on YouTube. Julio is the author of 2 books and numerous articles in professional journals, and he is here with us from the sunny Spain to talk about bilingualism. But before I turn the floor to our distinguished speaker, I need to say this, otherwise I'm not going to sleep tonight. On a very personal note, I had this great pleasure and honor of attending 2 of Julio's units back in those days that I did my master's at the University of Manchester. I had this privilege to attend Julio's Introduction to Grammatical Theory and Minimalist Syntax modules. I'm a teacher and I've been teaching for so many years, but I've got to say that Julio is a fantastic teacher. I've never seen a teacher like Julio in my entire life. I like his teaching styles. I like his positive energy. I like the fact that he always has this big smile on his face, and he's always sending positive vibes to everyone around himself. He's a fantastic person, and I'm so happy that he's here with us. So, Julio, I'm not going to say anything more, and I'm going to turn the floor to you. Thank you very much for being with us, and please enlighten us.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Nima, for this very, very generous invitation. It's a real honor. It was also an honor to have you in class. You are a very participative, active student, always with brilliant ideas. You are a great presenter. And well, we were lucky to have you with us. And I'm glad that we are here today. Thank you, everyone. I see a lot of beautiful faces, as Nima said, very encouraging and very, you know, it's nice to see this on a Sunday, right? And well, I hope we have an interesting discussion on bilingualism. I'm pretty sure that many of you are already kind of convinced of many of the things I will be saying here, even though I'm Nima and myself, we are linguists, but I'm pretty sure many of these things will sound familiar, or maybe you've never thought about them, but you'll say, oh yeah, that makes sense. I identify with that. I can relate. The idea, as I said at the outset, when some of you were still not here, is that I think the whole point of this type of talk, of transfer talk, is, you know, even if you have an already convinced audience, in other words, if you, how can I put it? If you are already, if I'm preaching to the choir, still hopefully you will get some evidence, some arguments of the kind of ideas you can use to contest those claims by many people that bilingualism is wrong, or that bilingualism can be negative, detrimental to children's development, and other claims that are out there. Okay, so hopefully we will manage to get something out of this. As Nima said, the chat is not a possibility, so please make sure you ask me questions towards the end. Okay, I hope I don't make this too long. It will also depend on how you know, the faces you make while the faces you pull while I talk. But hopefully we'll have a very enriching discussion for all of us. Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. Can you just make sure you can all see it, right? Excellent. Let me place the camera on the button so that I see the stuff on the screen. So the title of today's talk is The Blessing of Bilingualism, and it's really a blessing to be here with you. So thank you again. All right, so what's the plan? We'll talk about a little bit about language diversity, because again, there are many misconceptions about diversity in terms of languages across the world. We will then delve into the issue of bilingualism and multilingualism, talk about some figures across the world and types of bilingualism that exist, that have been identified in the literature. Then we will talk about one of my favorite creatures, which is code switching. Is the best example of language contacts, right? When you have two languages that coexist in the same territory for a long period of time, the languages influence each other, and we'll see that code switching is probably the most prominent or attention drawing example. And then we'll discuss briefly, since I see children in the audience and parents, of course, about raising a child, raising a polyglot, basically, okay? Making sure that we are doing the best so that our kids acquire more than one language, more than the language of the environment, the language of the family, for instance, another language, etc. And then we'll briefly touch on the benefits that seem to be well known to most people, but we'll just repeat them because we shouldn't forget the many gains that bilingualism, multilingualism more generally, gives individuals, okay, and society at large, actually. All right, so that's basically the plan. And I look forward to your questions at the end. So please make sure you jot them down, okay? There we go. So there is one here. These are rhetorical questions that I launched there, since we don't have the chat and so on. If somebody wants to unmute themselves because they really want to make a contribution on the spot, by all means do so, okay? But otherwise you can defer the questions till the end. So do we agree or disagree with the following? Today, there are approximately 995 languages across the world. 995. Seems like a lot, seems like too few. Well, it turns out that it's too few. According to the Ethnologue, and you can just go to the Ethnologue every day to check how many languages there are across the world, today, there are 7,139. And this figure is constantly in flux, as you see there on the website, on these screenshot from their website. Why is it constantly in flux? Well, because languages are living entities, and some of them simply end up disappearing. It's a bit sad because you guys speak other languages, you are familiar with different languages, and you know that languages bear culture. Languages have traditions behind them. They have customs, they have poetry, they have jokes, they have tales, they have music. And well, when a language dies, in a way, you know, it's like dropping a bomb in a museum, as a famous linguist from MIT once said. It's like a whole cultural wealth that gets lost. And therefore, we should, as linguists and as, you know, responsible human beings, responsible citizens, strive to keep languages alive, okay? Many times languages simply die because there are few speakers, and you know, there are no children being raised in that language. And therefore, when the last living, you know, elderly person dies, the language dies with them. Clearly, languages need humans, right? We can write grammars, we can write dictionaries, we can collect videos, but if a language is basically not spoken, it will die. And we have the example of Latin, right, which is considered a dead language nowadays, the language of the Roman Empire, a language of power, a language of prestige that, however, got into a decline and ended up vanishing from the face of the earth as a living language, right? So, well, this happens typically also because there is a dominant, we call them killer language. It's a little bit dramatic, but that's the metaphor we use. Killer languages, the big languages across the world, which basically eat out the minority languages that end up being extinct, basically. That's the idea. So language preservations, that's one of the big things that we should always keep at the forefront when we do linguistics. And moving on to the issue of speaking multiple languages, the question arises as to how many people can speak more than one language around the globe. And here I give you several options: 1/3 of the world's population, 2/3 of the world population, 1 million people around the globe, or half of the world's population. And well, obviously, it's going to be a big figure, right? Because a minimum is 1 million. So there's a lot of people, but 1 million seems like too little. It turns out that according to experts, and well, these are not necessarily very conservative estimations, but according to experts, 2/3 of the world's population is able to use more than one language. Many people are multilingual, not just bilingual, multilingual. This means 66.6% of the population across the globe. That's a lot. That's a lot. And interestingly, that's only if we consider official languages, languages that are not just varieties of the same language, what we call varieties or dialects. No, this is just considering languages. So if we take into account the amount of people that speak different dialects, the amount of people who speak foreign languages and so on, many, many people are bilingual across the globe. The important thing, and this is the point to take home, I think, is that bilingualism is the norm worldwide, not the exception. Monolingual people tend to see monolingualism as the norm. Why? Well, because that's the reality that they are accustomed to, right? They see it from their perspective, from their angle, from their stance. But it turns out that, if you scratch a little bit, the surface, it turns out that, yeah, your culture, your country may be monolingual, but that doesn't imply that the rest of the world is like that. And in fact, the majority is bilingual or multilingual. So it's an extremely natural phenomenon. It's commonplace across the world, and we should not consider it the exception. It's rather the norm. Well, a bilingual is, and here we'll see that there are many definitions out there. Is a bilingual a person who acquired 2 languages from birth? Is a bilingual a person who studies 2 languages? A person who speaks 2 languages fluently? A person who can speak a language in person and over the phone? Well, of course, the last one is a little bit of a joke, but it turns out that all of the definitions might be correct to a certain extent, depending on the definition you look at. For a linguist, a bilingual is a person who can function in 2 languages, okay? We don't care about the level of proficiency. Of course, if you just know some greetings, right? Thank you in Spanish, things like that, that doesn't qualify, you don't qualify as a bilingual. But in general, a person who can use 2 languages is, for a linguist, a bilingual. But then you get all types of definitions out there. Just to give you, just to give you an example from way 2007, here you have a list that includes dozens of bilingual definitions, actually types of bilinguals: achieved bilingual, additive bilingual, unbilingual, ascendant bilingual, ascribed bilingual, asymmetrical bilingual, balanced bilingual, compound bilingual. You can find so many definitions out there. So clearly, who is bilingual is not an easy question. And this also depends on who you talk to. So for instance, in the United States, people who just speak the 2 languages will clearly be considered bilingual. So the standards are not that high. But if you actually ask people in Europe, and in Spain in particular, I'm very familiar with how people how people treat the issue of bilingualism here. Typically, a bilingual in Spain is just somebody who grew up acquiring both languages simultaneously. So the standards to determine whether somebody should be deemed to be bilingual here in Spain, for instance, are extremely high. But in the United States, on the contrary, they are pretty low, in such a way that anyone who can speak 2 languages, no matter how fluent they are in those 2 languages, is bilingual. Okay, so you have all these definitions there that you can find online, but it's interesting, right, that there is so much variation there within the realm of bilingualism. So far, so good. People haven't fallen asleep yet. Excellent. All right, so I'm glad we can keep going. A bilingual, this is a claim, okay? Is this true or false? Do we agree or disagree? A bilingual is the sum of 2 monolinguals in one. So think of a person named, say, Susan. Susan speaks English and Farsi. And Susan, when she speaks English, she's Susan English, subscripted English, and then when she speaks Farsi, she's Susan Farsi. In other words, to see it more visually, do we have a situation like the one we have on the screen now, person A and person B, language A, language B, or do we have more of a mixture? Well, the answer here again depends on who you ask. If you ask somebody who is a very purist teacher of foreign languages, who really teaches English in a very RP, Queen's English way, and you need to use the grammar perfectly and the vocabulary, and you should never mix the languages, and you should have the perfect accent, then they will probably tell you, no, a bilingual is the sum of two monolinguals in one, clearly. But it turns out that the bilingual reality, and those of you who have children, those there that are present here, will probably know that it's inevitable to mix the two languages. You may try, right? You may go into the classroom and try to speak perfectly and do this kind of in vitro perfect speech in one of the languages, but we all know that it's extremely difficult to keep them separate from each other. And it turns out that the view, the widely accepted view in the field is that a bilingual actually lives at the intersection that we see here marked in pink, okay? I'm a little bit colorblind, so I'm not sure if it's pink, but you know what I mean, okay? The colored part in the middle, basically the intersection set between the two languages. Of course, this would also apply to multilingual communities, but I just have two here for illustrative purposes. If we were dealing with three languages, we would have three sets and the intersection of the three sets, okay? So basically, a bilingual seems to live at the crossroads, at the intersection between the languages. Why? Well, because the linguistic reality, the truth is that languages are not what we think. Languages tend to be political, socio-cultural concepts rather than linguistic concepts. We linguists tend to talk about repertoires, okay, of linguistics. We have a system of linguistic repertoires, and you know, the very definition of language is a political one. It tends to have to do with language, and as you know, certain countries will have a language, call it one way, and then the neighbor next door will use the same language, just a dialect, and we call it something different. Well, we have the example in Yugoslavia, right? The former Yugoslavia. You had Serbo-Croatian, and now people talk about Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian. When, if you talk to a linguist, my supervisor, Professor Željko Bošković from the University of Connecticut in the United States, he will talk about Serbo-Croatian, because yeah, there are dialectal differences, but ultimately these were one and the same language, just spoken in different parts. Same for Valencian, which is similar to Catalan, but it's spoken in Valencia province of Spain rather than in Catalonia. But ultimately they are the same language with, of course, geographic differences that we expect to find anywhere. You find differences from one town to the next, and if you're familiar with the northwest of the United Kingdom, you'll see that somebody in Leeds speaks differently from somebody in Manchester, who in turn speaks differently from somebody in Liverpool. So clearly, we expect different dialectal differences. There's nothing wrong with that. That's natural. Again, so much diversity in language. But ultimately, the bottom line is that, in general, influence is inevitable. There is nothing wrong with it. It's totally natural. It's a consequence of being bilingual. And it's something we should be proud of, because in much the same way as we have this kind of intersective set in terms of the language, we also have it in terms of the culture. So we live in a kind of, we will experience a hybrid culture that is very, very rich, because it gets bits and pieces from different cultures, and that is very rich. That's beautiful. Some people may despise it, but in reality, it's a blessing. It's a blessing to have that possibility. Okay, so it's very difficult to decompose a bilingual into two. Just to give you some examples, today we'll focus mostly on code switching, but you know, the languages, the influence between languages will be very clear and visible in terms of the borrowings, the words that we loan from another language, and I'm sure I know Farsi is full of English borrowings, right? We do that in Spanish all the time, in particular to do with vocabulary that is related to, for instance, technology, okay? Tends to be in English. This is the case in Spanish. And then we adapt the word to even to the spelling and everything, but it's still a borrowing from English, right? Code switching, the mixture that we will talk about, so I won't stop to discuss that one now. And then also calques, that's very common when the languages influence each other, to use a structure in a language with the words from the other language, right? But you kind of use the syntax, the grammar from one of the languages. This is very common. Of course, pronunciation, even gestures, right? If you take an Italian person, when they do like this, right? When they do like that, that's something that inevitably an Italian person who may speak English as well, they may do this when speak English as well. Okay, nothing wrong with that. It's a mutual influence. But we shouldn't forget what I mentioned a couple of times already, this idea of becoming multicultural or bicultural, a mixture of aspects, a blend of aspects of more than one culture, a hybrid. The word hybrid tends to have a negative connotation, but there's really nothing wrong with it. It's just the product of mixing, of coexisting, of life, of being alive, right? There's really nothing wrong with that. And we should still really strive to debunk those myths, because there is nothing wrong with living at the intersection. That's a common situation across the world, as we've seen. All right. Next, what I believe to be a beautiful quotation from Gloria Anzaldúa in Borderlands, La Frontera, which is a very interesting, literary piece of literary work that I strongly recommend if you're interested in issues to do with feminism, living on the border, and things like that. It's very nice. I'll read it out loud. Borders are set up to define the places that are safe and unsafe, to distinguish us from them. A border is a dividing line, a narrow strip along a steep edge. A borderline is a vague and undetermined place created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants. So if you're interested, for instance, in general issues, but with this, based on the specific example of Spanish in the United States, Anzaldúa is a very good choice. And in her writing, she always reflects this idea of borders being, basically unnatural boundaries there, right? And we see this all the time. We are seeing it now with the unfortunate war that just broke out in Ukraine, right? Anyway, I don't want to get sad today. So agree or disagree again, code switching or code mixing, these are typically used interchangeably, only occurs in some bilingual societies, not in all. What do you mean in some, but not in all? Well, in general, code switching occurs very naturally. No sooner two languages get into contact, okay? That's basically an inevitability of being bilingual. And let me just give you some examples. In the part of Spain where I'm from, Asturias, capital Oviedo, that Nima mentioned at the introduction, we also speak Asturian, which is a Romance language extremely similar to Spanish, but not the same. Okay, it's a different language, also coming from Latin. And we use code switching all the time. People don't even know they are mixing two languages. They think they speak one language, but in reality they are using two, but many people are not even aware. And here you have an example of Spanish in red and Asturian in blue. They are very similar, but for instance, the position of certain pronouns changes, the pronunciation changes, obviously some words change, but ultimately the foundation, the syntactic foundation is pretty similar. And that's just one example that is close to my case. Okay, it's in a book that will be coming out hopefully at the end of 2022. It's called Linguistics for Life. in Spanish. Lingüística para la vida is actually one of my first publications in Spanish. I've never written in Spanish academically. Another example, English-Spanish, of course, very common in places such as Gibraltar, the United States, and also in the UK, because we, in much the same way as there are a lot of Iranians in the UK, there are also a lot of Spanish people, in particular after the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, a lot of people started migrating to the United Kingdom. The number has actually gone down now after Brexit and after the pandemic, unfortunately. So I love staying at home durante el confinamiento actual en Gran Bretaña. Okay, that's a spontaneous example. Somebody who loved being at home during lockdown. To be honest with you, I don't even know how somebody can utter that. There's nothing worse than a lockdown, but I guess they enjoyed it, at least at the beginning. Another example, Catalan Spanish, also very common. Dice que hay un tío que va al médico y that diu is clearly Catalan, okay? She or he says that there's a guy who goes to the doctor and says blah, blah, blah. So you see, this is already from 1987. It's extremely natural and it's always been there, okay? And of course, we also find examples of code switching between languages which are typologically different. So Russian and English have a very different syntax, and yet you do find code switching. The example is kind of quirky, but I won't read it because I don't want to embarrass myself in Russian. But you can see how they are mixing, how they are putting words and expressions into a sentence whose foundation is Russian, right? We are TESOL affiliate. That means those who have sent the proposal for the conference will participate in it, okay? It's kind of funny sentence. And of course, we also find examples of Farsi English. I'm sure you were all thinking about how you mix the two languages. And of course, you don't need the translation, but I have it here for professional purposes, of course, and in order to give credit to the person who reported this in their research. At the end, please, if somebody can explain to me, please jot it down. If somebody can explain to me how your last names, your surnames work, I'll be so happy to understand that, because it's like we in Spain, we have 3 names, the first name and then 2 last names, and we always get cited incorrectly and so on. And I think you also have a lot of names going on there. But anyway, the important thing is that you definitely have examples of code switching, even in the Farsi English context. People claimed at some point that it's not common to have code switching when the 2 languages are typologically very different. And of course, you know that Farsi person has the head at the end. It's very different from English structurally, and yet you can, on occasion, code switch. You'll tell me more, of course. I want to know more from your own experiences at the end. And this influence, it goes beyond code switching. We find it everywhere, I think. Most cultures that have, the English influence in one way or another have experienced this. In Spain, this is becoming very common, but it's not difficult to find examples of Farsi English mixtures and so on in songs, as we will see in a second. It's no longer Saturday night, so please refrain from dancing, okay? Examples all over the place in most languages. English, of course, is a language whose influence is inevitable across the world, and Spanish, Farsi are no exception. So, code switching does not occur in bilingual children's spontaneous speech. No, children speak properly, they acquire one, they acquire the other, and they never mix. That's wrong. Children are also susceptible to this influence. Why? Because this influence, as we said, is natural and inevitable. And as we know, children are the most uninhibited creatures in the world. So why would they not mix? It's natural, just do it, right? And I think we should as parents and as individuals in general, we should be very, very mindful of the fact that there is nothing wrong with the mixture, and that children are not mislearning language because they mix. They are just behaving bilingually, which is what they should do if they are acquiring more than one language. I think this is important, and we should be very, very careful when telling children off because, oh, don't mix, your English will be damaged, and you know, ridiculous misconceptions like that. Children actually mix extremely naturally. Just to give you a couple of examples from children in the United States that were raised bilingually, children that spoke English and Spanish, for instance, Leo, at age 2 years, 2 months, and 21 days, very young, already said things like, there are bunnies here, or this other kid, Carla, who at age 2 years and 7 months, okay, pretty young, already said things like, oh, mi corazón se llama cold heart, okay? Oh, my heart is called cold heart. So you see the mixture from very, very early on. At the Instituto Cervantes of Manchester, a very cute child named Marco, a few years ago, uttered the following sentence to their teacher. Their teacher was a trilingual teacher who spoke English, Italian, and Spanish. And the child knew that. The child said, oh, we can speak everything together because you also speak Italian, Spanish, English. So the child was very smart and very aware of his bilingualism. And one day the child said, whatever the name of the teacher was, dobbiamo comer now, which is super cute because if you see the syntax is perfect. Should we eat now for Italian, English, and Spanish, but crucially, the three words, the modal verb, the must is on the left. Must we eat now? Sorry, I mixed. Oh yeah, I'm mixing the colors. Sorry, in my mind. No, it's because I read too quickly. So must eat now, basically, right? That's the idea behind those words. And the child said it extremely naturally. He didn't question it, and he knew that his teacher would perfectly understand this sentence. For him, it was the most natural thing to say. As an anecdote, and I think this is important, I want you to also know that even though many people will say that code switching is, an aberration, code switching is an example of the fact that you mix languages because you don't know the languages. Therefore, you just mix because you are resorting to multiple languages when you could say it all in one. No, that's wrong. Multilingualism implies that you will mix, that languages will influence each other, and that you will use code switching. And as an anecdote, I want you to take home the following example as well. In Papua New Guinea, okay, there is a culture there where mixing three languages, more specifically Bwang, Tok Pisin, and Yaben, is considered a sign of prestige. So for instance, if there is a politician giving a speech in public as a sign of multiculturalism, and as a sign of respect for the multiple languages that people speak there, they will use the three languages and mix them, because that's a sign of, well, look, we coexist, and the languages are happy together and the cultures are happy together, and that's totally fine. So what does this tell us? That what's prestigious in one part of the world may not be prestigious somewhere else, and of course vice versa. And importantly, many of those who are against code switching should know that in some parts of the world, code switching is just prestigious. There is really nothing wrong with it. And again, this tells us that it's all based on prejudice. When something linguistic is not prestigious, no, that's not well-spoken, no, that's not classy, that's not really English, oh, that's wrong, you're uneducated, and so on and so forth, that typically comes as a result of prejudice. There is nothing linguistic that makes one language or one variety better than another. It's all in our minds. It's all the opinion of an elite. This doesn't mean that we should throw away the grammar books or just speak however we want or write incorrectly when we are giving a speech. So for instance, I'm giving a talk now. Obviously, I'm using a certain type of language, right? I'm not just using foul language or screaming. Of course, we need to abide by certain, guidelines for gatekeeping. And if you go to a job interview, if you write a cover letter, an application for a school, obviously you need to use language properly. But spoken language, the language we use in daily life, the language we use in social media, even in writing nowadays, it's different, right? And there's really nothing wrong with just using language the way it naturally comes to us, because language is a wonderful miracle, is an amazing resource we have, and that we should really take advantage of. So another take-home message there. Another question: bilingualism can be attained even without formal education. In other words, can we become bilingual even if we don't take classes in a language and so on? Well, when you are an adult, it's not easy. I'm sure some of you have experienced that, moving to another country, trying to learn the language without going to classes in the language, just by full immersion. When you're an adult, it's different, right? It's difficult. When you are a child, you can just acquire any languages and not ever learn how to write or read. So you can be a bilingual who doesn't know how to write or read or write, sorry. And actually, I have a nice example from a video from actually the Pet Shop Boys that I hope you enjoy. And I hope you can hear it properly. Based on Elvis's You're Always on My Mind, but it's just an example, right? A bilingual illiterate. I can't read into languages. That's totally fine.
Where are you from?
Formal education is not really required. Children can acquire a second language during childhood by just watching TV. This is something that parents ask me all the time. Should I play cartoons in English? Should I have the TV on in English? Should I play songs in English? Yes, you should, because it's not going to hurt at all. There's nothing wrong with that. If children like the cartoons in Russian, even if they don't understand much, there's nothing wrong with that. It will make them more open-minded. It will make them more aware of other cultures. But unfortunately, the TV is not a language teacher. Why? Well, the answer that experts provide is very clear. Children need to know, to think, to be, to rest. I mean, they need to know for sure that the language that they are listening, that the language that they are acquiring serves a purpose, a communicative purpose, more specifically. In other words, children need to see it as a tool. So, just by having the TV on, they will maybe have a better ear for foreign languages when they grow up, probably, but it won't teach them the language. Of course, it can be a supplement. It can be an aid, right? If you say you want them to learn language X and you live in another country, you speak that language X with them, and then on top of that, you show them cultural aspects by means of the TV in that language, that's perfect. But don't expect, the TV to be a language teacher for free. No, it doesn't work like that, because children need an interlocutor. Children need somebody with whom to communicate. Children basically need to know that the language will serve a purpose to acquire it. Again, it's something they do very naturally. We'll talk about child language acquisition in a second. But it's something they do so involuntarily that for them, it has to have a purpose. They won't just do it for the sake of it. So that's another myth we should debunk. The TV might be helpful, but it won't do the job of teaching or instilling language into a child, okay? Now, I'm gonna give you a bunch of factors, a host of factors, and there is one which is not crucial for bilingual language acquisition to occur. I think it will be pretty intuitive, but we'll see what you think. Age of acquisition, in other words, how young you are when you acquire the language. the quantity of the linguistic samples, the input we call it, that the children are exposed to, the quality, not just the quantity, but also the quality of that input, the type of language being acquired. So for instance, I speak a Germanic language, English. I speak a Romance language, Spanish. I speak an East Asian language, Mandarin Chinese, the type of language, or parents, caregivers' attitudes towards bilingualism. Well, only one of them is not crucial. And the one that is not crucial is the type of language being acquired, okay? The type of language being acquired is irrelevant. Children don't distinguish languages. Children just absorb whatever they are exposed to. Evidence strongly indicates that children there are no differences when a child learns a language, from birth in a naturalistic environment. There is really no difference that has to do with the language they are acquiring in such a way that a child acquiring Russian will acquire Russian in much the same way as a child will acquire Mandarin Chinese, Farsi, Spanish, Catalan, Asturian, or the language that you want. Even American or British or any sign language, any of the sign languages of the 300 sign languages that exist across the world. Okay, that's another important misconception. People tend to think that there's only one sign language. No, there are more than 300 across the world. And children that are exposed to a sign language will acquire the sign language in parallel fashion to speaking children who acquire a spoken language. Okay, that's another thing a point to take home. So age of acquisition is crucial. Quantity, you need at least 20% of the day of exposure to a particular language per day. So if you want to raise a child speaking 100 languages, that might not be very practical. Children may have the brain, the mind may have the ability, but we don't have the time, which is very unfortunate, right? This is an example of how life goes back so quickly. We really don't have time to acquire 100 languages from birth. But we know that the limit is pretty high. There are cases of children who speak up to 10 languages, which is pretty impressive. But you need good quantity and good quality, okay? You need to be exposed to languages, not just having the TV on. And of course, the parents and caregivers' attitudes towards bilingualism, that's crucial. Of course, that's crucial. If you go home and you tell your children, oh, don't learn this language, I won't speak to you in this language, it's useless, who cares about this language? You will basically kill it, at least in that family, you will kill that language. So the attitude that we have as parents, caregivers, and so on and so forth is crucial for language development, both in monolingual and in bilingual settings, okay? So the type of language, that's irrelevant. And this is just a very famous graph in linguistics, which is shown to indicate that the age of acquisition is crucial. As you can see, there is a negative correlation between the proficiency levels, okay, when you do an exam to gauge the level, the command of the language. The younger you are, as you can see, native from 0 to 3, the younger you are, the higher the level of attainment. Look at the age of arrival in a country. When you go there at age 1, your proficiency will be super high. But the older you are, and we're talking about 39 maximum, not 89, look at the proficiency attainment level in general, of course. You have people who are super talented for languages and who will acquire a language without an accent at age 50, but those are a tiny minority, okay? But as you can see, the conclusion here is that there is a negative correlation between age and language attainment. So conclusion, the younger you are, the better. If you can expose your children to a language from very, very early on, that's the whole point. That's the best thing you can do, because that guarantees good attainment of the language, okay? The younger, the better. Let me just give you a few, in very broad strokes, what language acquisition in general consists of. We call it L1 because that's the language you learn when you are born. This actually applies, extends completely to bilingual or multilingual contexts. These, again, you may know, but I think it's important that we keep it in mind, again, when we are going to raise a child, or when people start, giving us some of the misconceptions about how language acquisition proceeds. Language acquisition is a very fast process. If you think about it, in the course of 3-4 years, children acquire a language that is so complex grammatically, the vocabulary. There is a point when children acquire up to 11 words per day. Can you imagine? Has anybody tried to learn, say, German? Can you imagine learning 11 German words in a day? Children do that, and they do it without even giving it a thought. It's an effortless process. Children don't have to think about acquiring a language when they just absorb it from the environment. Children don't say, okay, I have to learn how to breathe. I have to I have to learn how to pee. Well, you have to learn how to pee properly, right? For our standards, using a toilet and so on. But, just having a wee is clearly something that doesn't require much effort in normal circumstances, right? Acquiring a language doesn't imply any effort on the part of children. They just do it effortlessly and, crucially, involuntarily. Children don't choose whether to acquire a language or not. You'll never see a 2-year-old saying, oh no, I'm not learning anything anymore. I don't want to listen to this language. You may have a choice at some point, and children may prefer one language over the other for cultural reasons, because one of the languages is the one that gives them a certain advantage for social purposes, right, in life. But the reality is that we don't choose. We don't have an option there, okay? We just acquire the languages we're exposed to. And under normal circumstances, meaning in normally developing children, we see that child after child, language after language, country after country, language acquisition is a very successful process. Everybody acquires a language under normal circumstances. Of course, I'm not talking about literacy here, reading or writing, as we saw at the beginning of the song before. I'm talking about language, okay? Using a language for communication orally. I'm not talking about writing or writing literally or being able to use very sophisticated vocabulary. I'm talking about speaking a language. It's also a universal process in that children that are exposed to a sign language, they acquire it. No tribe has been found that lacks human language. So you find tribes in the mountains that have been, detached, separated from the rest of the world for thousands of years, and it turns out that they have communication. Wherever there's people, there's language. And that's beautiful because, well, as two very famous linguists once said, language is our humanity. It's beautiful, right? Humanity is our language. Language is our humanity. Language is a distinctive characteristic of human beings. It's one of the most interesting things that we possess, and one that really sets us apart from other species, and one that might be responsible for our great success as a species, okay? It's a very uniform process, which again is very striking because child after child, you observe the same phases. The child bubbles, the child starts using one word, the child starts using 2-word combinations. Then the child starts overgeneralizing. This is very common. Children will say things like 2 foot instead of 2 feet, or, oh, it braked instead of it broke. That's extremely common in all languages. Children do that at some point. I'm sure you can think of examples of those generalizations. We even do it when we learn a foreign language, right? A friend of mine the other day was trying to speak English to me, and she said, "Oh, where is the bread?" And she said, "Oh, I put it in the kitchen, right? Put it instead of I put it, because it's irregular." That's super common. Super common. And even in our own language, sometimes we regularize. Another aspect that defines language acquisition is that there are not many substantive errors. The errors are typically errors of omission. Okay, so the child, instead of saying my daddy is nice, will say daddy nice, daddy kiss, right? Instead of my daddy will kiss me. Those words that are function words, like auxiliary verbs, articles, things that are there for grammatical reasons, children will avoid, but that doesn't mean that they create sentences that are fully ungrammatical. Children will never say something like blue, put, the, nice, tomorrow, pen on table, right? Errors like that, potential errors, never occur in the speech of children. Which is impressive, right? How this whole process takes place almost miraculously. Clearly, this points to some sort of genetic predisposition for language. We have a brain for language. We have a brain that has areas that are dedicated to language acquisition and to language production and comprehension. So, for instance, in this part of the left hemisphere, we have what's been called Broca's area in the brain, which is responsible for speech production, and Wernicke's area here in the back of your brain. That's where Wernicke's area is located, which is devoted to language comprehension. How do we know about those? Well, mostly from cases of aphasia, okay, loss of language due to injury, for instance, brain damage, and you know, in the past, Broca and Wernicke, many years ago, they discovered that patients who had some issue with language, once they died, they performed an autopsy, and they discovered that those parts of the brain were physically damaged. So they correlated physical damage in the brain with a particular linguistic behavior, okay, something that was malfunctioning. Extremely interesting, but it all points to the same conclusion, that clearly language is part of our genetic endowment. We are ready for language. Otherwise, it's impossible to explain this behavior that children across cultures exhibit, okay? It's actually an easy thing for them. It's effortless. They don't really have to make a big effort. And as I said, this uniformity is also observed in the phases that children go through, which are the same for all of them. Clearly, again, pointing to some biological calendar, biological schedule that children follow. And ultimately, it's a very successful process. In 3 or 4 years, we have a speaker of one or more languages, a successful speaker of those languages. How can we raise a child bilingual, or how can we make the child become a polyglot? That's an important question, because there's a lot of lack of knowledge of how this works. There is really no golden rule, but some of the advice that experts give includes having one person, one parent, one language. So if you are lucky and you speak language A, your partner speaks language B, it's ideal because you will expose the children to those two languages with each of the parents or each of the people raising them, okay? We want to make distinctions in terms of gender, etc. The one parent, one language approach, one person, one language approach. This seems to be the optimal case scenario. But that's obviously an idealization, because not everybody marries or has children with or lives with somebody who has another language, right? Sometimes you do both share the same language, the family shares the same language, and then there is the language of the society into which they migrate that they use and that they want to raise their children in as well. And that's not as easy, right? So the one person, one language approach is beautiful, but it's not ideal for everyone for obvious reasons. Using the minority or the heritage language at home is typically a very, very good idea. Why? Because the child will grow learning the language at school, the language of the society, the majority language, but at home, they will still preserve the minority one. Of course, many children will opt to for a while at least, abandon the minority, the heritage language, because that language is not the language of social success. Children go to school, and say Spanish child in the UK goes to school and learns English, and soon realizes that, wow, English is making me better. English is making me strong. I have friends, you know, so I go home and I decide not to speak Spanish anymore, because now English is the one that gives me this social advantage. It's true. This happens all the time. I'm sure you've had this experience. What can we do to combat that? Well, to combat that, the best thing is to really have try to keep the language live at home, to give it the prestige it deserves, and to show the child that, you know, they should have a high self-esteem in that language as well, that there is really nothing wrong with that, and that's the culture that you have, and that's the best way to transmit and to bear that culture is through that particular language. So I think we need to do some work there to really persuade the child that there is really nothing wrong with both, that they can mix, that they can actually be richer than many other individuals who are not multilingual or bilingual. Okay. Obviously, one of the pieces of advice that we are typically given is to relocate to a new country. Well, yeah, of course, it's not as simple, right? But definitely it does help. And of course, language immersion programs, bilingual education, dual programs typically help. Depends on how those are implemented. Some of them have proven successful, some of them have proven rather unsuccessful, but going to a bilingual school typically helps preserve, maintain the language, and also, of course, help with the self-esteem that we were talking about earlier, right? This idea of you can be happy in both languages. They don't really compete, okay? They are resources that we have available. And of course, the obvious one, which is language classes, right? If you take classes in that language, even if it's just at home, they will see that, wow, look, there is literacy in this language. People write and read, and I'm learning about the culture. You can do that at home if you read tales to your children in the language that you bring, the heritage language, right? The family language. These are the typical ways in which we can raise a child bilingual. I know it's not easy. The theory is beautiful. Oh no, I'm gonna just speak this language to them. But then at some point you give up, or you get tired, or if it doesn't come naturally, it's difficult to push it. That's true. But I think we should make an effort to preserve the language. And in fact, we are giving the child something that will at some point become a blessing. Children are not aware of the benefits of being bilingual when they are young, right? We have a brain ready for language when we are very young, but we are too young to care. And as parents and caregivers, we are the ones who should inculcate that into the kids, because that's probably something that will be a very good investment for the future. Is there a limit to the number of languages that the child may acquire? Well, I think I answered this question earlier. Potentially, grammatically, brain-wise, there is no limit, but we do have a limit in the sense that if normally you need 20% of the daytime, of the time of the day to be exposed to that language, it's impossible we don't have more hours, right? So anything above 10 really sounds really, really difficult and untenable. But potentially the sky is the limit. There is really no limits. Okay, and just to conclude, I'll give you some of the benefits that many of you may be aware of being bilingual or multilingual. Obviously, biculturalism, multiculturalism, something I've insisted on throughout. The ability to mix languages, this gives us richness of expression. This also allows us to use a cryptic code with other bilinguals, okay? It's the shared code that you and me, because we share that language, we have two languages in common. We can play with the language, be much richer in terms of expression and so on. So why not mix? Experts report a delay in the onset of Alzheimer's disease. This, it's not clear whether this comes when you learn a language when you are an adult. whether this only comes when you acquire them from birth, but it seems that it definitely helps. Okay, it's not detrimental at all. If anything, it's beneficial in that regard. Quick thinking is another feature of bilinguals. Why? Because, well, you have these very rich linguistic repertoires, this system in your brain. So typically, you think more quickly, you think faster. However, there is a little problem that we have as bilinguals many times, which is word finding. And I'm sure this has happened to many of you, that you're thinking of a word and sometimes you say, oh my God, this is coming in English, but not in Farsi, or, oh my God, I don't know, the word is not coming in either of my languages, which is very frustrating. I'm sure you all have had that, but monolinguals also have that, trust me. That can be a little disadvantage, but that shouldn't preclude us from becoming bilingual or multilingual. Of course, job opportunities, because people are more and more aware, thank goodness, of the benefits of speaking more than one language. And in a very global world, we have people from all over the world here today. Diversity is inevitable, multicultural communication is inevitable. So any language that you speak is an added advantage in your CV, and this can be extremely useful when it comes to the job market. And also, people are more and more aware of the cognitive advantages of being bilingual, being able to talk to more people, be more open-minded, being able to understand other cultures, be more respectful of diversity, and so on and so forth. And this is, if you want, also part of these personal opportunities. You can travel more, you can learn aspects of other cultures, you can understand human nature much better. The ability to compare and contrast languages, translation. Being bilingual doesn't make you a good translator, but it does make you very, very aware of differences between languages. So you are kind of a linguist, okay? Even if you are not a real linguist, you do have this ability to know, oh wait, no, but I put this word at the end in this language, but not in the other. That, if you just speak one language, usually you don't compare, or you don't even think about such things. But being bilingual actually automatically kind of makes you think a bit more about such comparisons, which is always good, right? It's always nice. It's good for the brain to look at these linguistic puzzles and think, oh, interesting. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we have that sound here, but not in English. Yeah. Wow, cool. And as I mentioned, an appreciation for linguistic diversity, which is very important. And I think it's just one example of the respect we should all have for each other in such a diverse world, okay, where we all live. And that's basically it. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Julio. Yeah, yes, absolutely. I agree with you. Yeah. Thank you so very much, Julio, for this fantastic talk. So before we move on to the Q&A session, let me just say this, that as you know, 21st of February is chosen by UNESCO as the International Mother Language Day. And it's very fortunate to have this webinar a week after that, on the 27th. So yeah, what a coincidence to have this webinar just a week after 21st of Feb. So before we get to the Q&A session, Julio has posed a question to the Persian speakers in the room. Challenge accepted. I'm not qualified enough to answer the questions, but if you are, then please feel free to answer the question, because Julio has already posed a very interesting question to the Persian speakers in the room. So before we move on to the Q&A session, I'm just going to ask the Virtual Persian Academy's headmistress, Mrs. Rosa Rosti, to share her insights with us on this, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia, for your insight talk. It was really amazing presentation. And also thank you for your value time. خیلی ممنون نیما جان بابت تمام ارگانایز های شما. به زبان مادری آقای خولیو بلد نیستم که ازشون تشکر کنم، ولی از شما به زبان مادریتون فارسی تشکر میکنم. مرسی بابت این پروگرام. Thank you so much for your managing. Thank you. And it was the perfect program and webinar for our academy. Just I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Rosa June. And right, okay, let's go to the interesting part, the Q&A session. I have so many questions to ask, but I'm going to be nice and I would not start asking questions first. So if anybody has any questions, then you can just raise your hand either physically or virtually, and then I can say your name, you can unmute yourself and you can ask your questions. Right, whilst we're waiting for people to ask us questions, Julio, one of the questions I have is, you know, speaking of bilingualism, and I think this is one of the questions that many of the participants have. When is the, I don't know if there is a good time, but when is a good time to learn a second language? Because, you know, there is this debate, as you know. Some people say the sooner you learn a second language, the better. But then, on the other hand, some people say that, no, you're going to have to wait for your child to get matured, to reach the age of puberty, and then eventually you can encourage them to learn a second language. So is there a good time to learn a second language? Do we have to wait for them to get matured, or they can learn a second language at the same time as their first language, the thing that we call simultaneous bilingualism? What do you think?
I'm a firm believer that the younger, the better. Why? Well, because if you want them to be fluent, to have a good accent, and to not have to make such a huge effort, the best is that you start really before the onset of puberty. If you want to learn it because you want to become, I suppose my case, right? And I started at age 16, exactly when I shouldn't have started. That's why I have an accent. That's why, you know, English is not my mother tongue and it's not a native language. It's clearly a foreign language. Well, if you want to do it like I did, I'm not saying it's wrong, but now that I see my nieces going to English school, playing games in English, and you talk to them, you know, very basic, you give them basic sentences and they understand, and you tell them about things when they are playing and they give you the fruit, and I think that's amazing and it's enviable. I think for them it's a game and it's lovely. So I think they are doing them a huge favor by exposing them to English now rather than wait, right? When the brain is not as ready. However, I do agree that certain aspects, so for instance, explicit grammar is better when you are already more mature, clearly. You cannot take a 3-year-old and tell them about the subjunctive or about prepositions because they won't care and they won't understand it. It's way too abstract for a 3-year-old. The 3-year-old is a language acquirer, not a linguist or a grammarian. So definitely I would say that the younger, the better. But of course, if you want to teach them stylistics or advanced writing or grammar, that's probably not the best idea when you're too young. You need a certain maturity for that. But I'm a big defender of the idea that the younger you are exposed to language, the more naturally it will come to you. So I wouldn't say 1 month old, but you know, if you can take them to an English school or to any language school when they are 4, 5, that's perfect, because they started getting used to it and they will play games, and being exposed to the language early on is much better for the achievement of pronunciation. Good pronunciation typically comes when you are very young, so it's easy to have a foreign accent unless you are exposed to language before puberty. So yeah, that's my view. But of course, other people may think differently, but I think the younger the better. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ali Mahdavi has a question to ask you.
Yes, thank you very much for the webinar. It was really helpful for me to understand bilingual Obviously, I am coming from engineering background. I haven't got any basically education in this field. However, I've got quite a few questions. You mentioned there is nothing wrong with the using multi-words in a bilingual system if a child basically using different words in different languages, and that makes me a bit worried about alienation. You know, it depends what you want to achieve by teaching a child another language. Do you want to get by? Do you want them to get by? Or you want them to be basically useful in the society in the right level of contact? If you want to get them by, yeah, okay, fine. To be honest, if I go back to my country, I might be alienated as well, because every single time I enter to the social media, I find different languages generated by the new generation, and you just literally don't understand what they're talking about by these abbreviations they do use. But the fact is actually you want to teach a child to not to be alienated in her society, and I believe if a child, you know, enters to that, you know, different culture and using a different amalgamation of the words, as you mentioned, and you mentioned there's nothing wrong with it. Yeah, okay, fine. Obviously, she is a bilingual or he is a bilingual, but it alienates them inside that society. If we don't teach them the right level of body language, don't teach them the right level of words that they need to use, and we say, oh, that's perfectly fine. You can use, you know, at the end of your statement, or you don't have to basically. In fact, giving that green light doesn't make you concerned. That makes them alienate in other language.
Ali, let me, before you go on, because you said you have several questions anyway.
Yes,
we'll see, but maybe I wasn't clear in that respect. What I mean is that, of course, that mixture of languages needs to be context appropriate. In other words, if my partner speaks English and Spanish, my friends speak English and Spanish. When I'm out with them, I code switch a lot, and I use a lot of English expressions. Some friends are teachers of mine who taught me here in Oviedo, and when we are together, we obviously play with language a lot. But I remember talking to my grandmother, who died at the age of 91 in 2016, spent a whole day with her, and never did I utter a word in English. Or if I'm talking to some of my friends who don't speak English, if I say something in English, I'll say, oh my God, sorry, and I'll translate it. So I think it's part of being bilingual, multicultural, but it's not isolated in the sense that, oh, I'm going to go out here in my town where nobody speaks English and start mixing. They will say I'm stupid, basically. Or, oh, look at this posh guy. He wants to pretend he speaks more than one language. He's trying to come across as fancy, right? So obviously, what I'm, this open-mindedness is about bilingual societies, bilingual groups, right? When you are with other bilinguals, I'm not saying that you should start mixing like crazy in any context, but language contact is still inevitable because English is there even for monolinguals. In other words, all the words that we borrow from the English language, sometimes my friends, I'm taken aback when I hear them use certain words, and I feel like, oh my God, they just said that in English with obviously more Spanish pronunciation, but still English. And now it turns out that that word is used in that context, and these people don't speak the very first word of English. So language contact is it's really inevitable. And it's some people hate this influence, but others say, well, we should embrace it. It's natural. Language change typically occurs because of language contact. English has a lot of French words. Why? Well, because in 1066, 1066. That was the last time the British Isles were invaded. The Battle of Hastings took place, and the Normans took over. So they imposed English at high levels, and that's why formal English nowadays has so many French words: introduction, departure, thousands of words, and some of the structures even are from French. So to make the answer a bit shorter, to make a long story short, I think these all should be context appropriate. Of course, I'm not saying that a child should go to a school where nobody speaks language X and mix language Y with language X, because that wouldn't give an advantage to anyone, obviously. Sorry, Ali, I hope I've answered your question more or less.
Yes, indeed. But I still believe that actually the body language and the it has also need to be taught to the children with the language, because you can't use the the hands of the Italian way of speaking in the Persian culture.
Right.
Obviously, because people, you definitely get alienated and say, well, what the hell is talking about in that culture. So that's one thing. The just a little observation in your presentation, in the Farsi, the Beshavad, I think was correct. I think the one you quoted from Persian guy was Beshavam or something, or something like that. It was written. If you want to review that.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I took it literally from their thing. So
that's right. No, it's it was just an observation. Sorry, I've got another question here.
Ali, sorry to interrupt you, Ali John. If you don't mind, we will come back to you, Ali John, because there are other people.
Sure, fine. Yeah.
Yeah, we will.
Sorry.
Come back
okay.
Just one question at a time.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Fine.
No worries.
Fine.
No worries, Ali. We will come back to you.
Yeah.
Julio, we have a question from Rita. On a personal note, Rita is my big sister, and I miss her so much, and I'm happy that she's here with us today. I wasn't really expecting to see her, but I missed her so much, and thank you for being. She's such a busy lady, but thank you for being here with us. Rita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Julio, thank you so much for the thought-provoking presentation. It was very insightful. Just on a separate note, I don't have any pressing question, just a quick reflection based on the popularity of bilingualism and the usefulness of the linguistic study. I'm a psychologist and I can see a lot of overlap between the two fields, but as an outsider, I think there is still need for dialogue outside of your community for the public. I'm aware that there is a lot of moves taken by people like yourself and Nima to amplify the linguistic voices. But yet again, I feel like there is still, little holistic appreciation of the research and advocacy for people who don't have invested interest in this field. And the word linguistic may still be underrepresented or unfamiliar or even intimidating for some people. So the useful knowledge you just shared with us, which I found immensely interesting, may not get the privilege or position to meet the justice. I was thinking on reflection to maybe invite different people with diverse inquiries to contribute and amplify the less heard knowledge in their own language, because I found the presentation in your simple language helpful to challenge discrimination in society. I don't know, what is your reflection on that?
Yeah, no, I think you put it very nicely, very eloquently. And yeah, I think we need the dialogue from different disciplines, of course, psychology, cognitive sciences in general. Linguistics is a cognitive science, right? So yeah, there's nothing I can add. I mean, I totally agree. We need to look at this from different angles. Many times what happens is that the phenomena that we linguists care about, psychologists look at them from a very different angle, and it looks like there is no the gap is not bridgeable, so to speak, but I think there should be a dialogue there, and we need to start a conversation, a proper conversation, and look at these things properly, because as you said, there's a lot of overlap, but you know, this is like certain things are in no man's land, right? Because we say, well, that's a psychology thing, and they will say, oh, that's a linguistic thing, but ultimately maybe it's both. And this should be a joint venture rather than an individual pursuit. So yeah, thank you so much, Rita.
Thanks for the reflection. Thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you, Rita. Tarannum has a question to ask you.
Hi, once again, thank you for your time. And I just had a question there, because that I'm like 11 right now, and like
Nice.
I guess like I'm kind of approaching that age where I'd have to start thinking about my GCSEs and stuff, and like obviously there's like language and GCSEs, and my parents are I guess pushing me to be able to get those GCSEs, and I just wanted to ask, is that like I have been learning French in like primary and now in secondary, and like, would you encourage to carry on a language you've been exposed to from quite a young age, and just like carry on that path, or would you like encourage to maybe learn another language and I guess expose yourself to that other language as well?
Well, as you can probably, that's very impressive that you are 11 and so mature. So I'm so happy to you made my day, right? It's amazing. But I would say that the more the merrier. You know, I think you've probably you probably now know me a little bit after the talk, and you'll see that for this kind of thing, I'm super open-minded. So I think the more languages you try, the better. However, I wouldn't abandon the language that you've been exposed to too early. Why? Because unfortunately, language loss is a fact. We call it language attrition. It's language loss, and this happens. We forget. Maybe not the mother tongue if you use it often and so on, but there is the problem of forgetting. I tried to learn German for 2 years, then I found it too difficult, then my schedule was too busy, and I couldn't, and I ended up basically forgetting it. I remember bits and pieces, but it's not really useful knowledge that serves any advantage, that serves any purpose at the moment, unfortunately. So if you mentioned French, for instance, if that's the case, I would keep doing French well beyond high school, and make it part of your life, and continue using it, and watch TV, you know, Netflix series and everything in the original version. Try to make it part of your life if you can, because that's the best way to maintain a language. If you abandon it and so on, it will become residual. And this is like everything, right? It's like a hobby. You abandon it. You were a painter, now you stop, or riding a bike even, and then you kind of lose it. It becomes secondary in your life. So if you want to do too, by all means, go for it, go for that. But I wouldn't abandon the language that you've already been exposed to from a young age. Hope that answers Tarannum. Sorry.
Yes, thank you so much.
And good luck with that. I'm sure you'll do fine. I'm sure you'll do great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tarannum. Good luck with your GCSEs. Ali Mahdavi, we are all ears.
Suppose, Nima, sorry, I've got another question which is actually continues with my first question I asked. There is a discussion about, the richness of a language. So the Persian is such a rich language. When you enter to it, it's really never-ending learning for even the professional Persian teachers and professional professors. They always found, fascinating the depth and basic richness of this language. We've got poems that still people don't understand it, and they still basically. They believe. I'm specifically. Nima perhaps knows the guys, Mr. Shafi Katkani. They believe that actually there is the. Perhaps you're not the right person to answer this question. I mean, there is actually political pose on actually bringing the second language or the third language, mother tongue, in different region of a country, whereas those languages, although it's good to teach them, but it's not good to promote them and bring them into the schools to the level that actually the Persian should be taught, because the richness and the actual because Persian can literally, it was the word he was using, he can literally wrestle with the Shakespeare with no problem. But you can't wrestle with the Kurdish language. I'm just saying, with no offense to any Kurdish in this, or with other language with the Shakespeare. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I totally understand, because Spanish is a little bit like that. The vocabulary is so rich, and there are so many ways of expressing things, and a lot of people studying old poems and things. And personally, I think that there is really no language superior to another. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the richness of a language is given by its users, by its people. So if a language lacks certain expression for something, typically what it does is precisely borrow from another language, as we do in Spanish all the time, and as I mentioned throughout, right? With English, for instance, you don't have a word for smartphone, to call it smartphone. We call them smartphones, for instance, in Spain. So I think you can enrich a language. The vocabulary can be enriched. You can, promote the production of literature. Of course, the language goes in parallel with the culture, and typically a rich language that has a lot of poetry, literary production in it is associated to a very rich, big culture that has developed throughout the centuries, and that's basically it. Asturian, which I mentioned, my language, is poorer in many respects than Spanish. Why? Because for many years it was confined to rural areas. So basically you have a lot of vocabulary about working the land, but you don't have any vocabulary about, programming in computers, for instance. But Asturian has the ability to borrow from Spanish, from English, from other languages, adapt those words, those expressions, and become rich. In other words, there is nothing really in English that makes it, for instance, superior to other languages or more expressive than other languages. And as you mentioned, the reasons are political. The reason that English is the world's lingua franca, the reason why English is the world's language, is because of the British Empire and then the American Empire, if you want. There's really nothing intrinsic to English. It could be Farsi, it could be Spanish, it could be Asturian, it could be Basque, Kurdish even, right? The world's language. It's just a historical accident that English was chosen, but it was chosen for political reasons, because the countries that spoke English were the ones that had the power. So for a linguist, at least, languages are all equal. They are just manifestations of this natural ability, this talent, this capacity that we share as humans for language. But of course, we respect linguistic diversity, because for us, there's really no such distinction. of course, culturally and politically and so on, different languages enjoy different statuses. That's out of the question, Ali. I think that's.
Yeah, just going back to my question, actually, but mixing the word may not be beneficial for the actual richness, to learn the right level of richness.
That's an open question. Some people find it enriching. Some people think it's detrimental. But again, there are so many words, right? English was enriched by the presence of French, and now when you read proper English, it's all French origin words. At the time, I'm sure the people who got the French to invade them found that terrible, and they were disgusted by those French words, and now it's prestigious. So these things change with time, you know. You never know. You never know what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Thank you very much, Ali. Pedro.
Hi, sorry, my name is actually Omid. I'm a father of two, Pedro and Flavio.
Oh, my apologies. My apologies.
No,
in that case.
that's what my label says. But yeah, I'm very interested for my kids to learn a bit more than they have. My mother tongue is Farsi, and my wife's mother tongue is Portuguese. So they have been exposed to certain level to the three languages. They go to an English school in Cambridge area. What I would like to know from your experience and your academy seems to be very online sort of orientated. What are your experiences in this particular for kids this age, 7 and 9? My younger one, Pedro, is restless. He can't sit behind the computer for 2 hours for a language lesson. So I'd like to hear your insight on that. And one benefit I personally would like to draw from this for my kids is, you know, many on a religious basis, many of the texts are in Farsi, Arabic, and many other languages, but definitely not English. Well, not the originals in English. So that's one of my ways I would like to look at this.
So, if I understand correctly, one of the issues, your concerns is online classes, right? I agree, and that's a problem. And the pandemic made this very clear that it's difficult to keep a 7-year-old in front of a computer. Clearly, right? So, well, the obvious solution to that is not take them to English classes online or any language classes online and do it in person, but that might not be feasible at all times. So really, I don't have any advice on how to keep a child in front of a computer and encourage them and make them enjoy it, to be honest, because the experiences I've seen with my partner teaching children actually online at the Instituto Cervantes for a while, it wasn't easy. The children get distracted, and you know, if it's a big group, it's tough. You had some very motivated ones that did amazingly and managed to handle Zoom and everything, sharing the screen and everything, but in general it's not easy. And again, they may see it as a kind of TV thing and not really see the real need to have a conversation there, right? So, well, if you yourself can do part of the job, so if it's, for instance, Farsi, and you can help them, maybe that's nice, in addition to just talking to them, like trying to read with them. Then there's, as you say, the choice of texts, right? That I cannot help. Probably Nima would be much more helpful than I would be, because obviously I'm speaking abstractly without confining it to one particular linguistic variety or language, right? So yeah, but definitely I'm glad that you want to raise them trilingual, or however many you can put into their lives, and that you're trying. but maybe a good idea would be to ask the academies, if they have any suggestions, because they'll have much more experience with kids on the online. But I understand it might still be a bit young to keep the attention, on one screen. The pandemic showed that it's not easy for anyone, right? For children in particular.
Thank you very much. Mariam, it's your turn. You can ask your questions.
Sure. Thank you very much for the insightful talk. I have a son who's really keen on learning languages. At the moment, we live in an English-speaking country, so he speaks English, Farsi since he was a child. Then we live in South Africa, so he started learning Zulu and Afrikaans a couple of years ago, and he started French last year, and he added the Spanish. He's gonna start soon. He's really keen, and he picks up things really quickly. My only concern is that I was talking about that 20% of the time per day to use the language in order to be not proficient, to improve on that language. I Googled a lot how I can find resources so that while he enjoys the language, he become proficient kind of in those languages, because one of the things he does is that he really loves teaching to others. So it's me and the younger brother who tries to teach French and Afrikaans and everything. But I feel like that I don't have enough resources, and I don't know the ways how to nurture this enthusiasm. And just to keep it in he can't be a professional, he can't be like a native English that language speaker, but anyway, how to help him to pursue this interest. I would like to know your opinion on that, please.
Well, given the way
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Oh, that was probably the machine, right? That's actually impressive. So congratulations, and well, definitely, I'm glad that you want to really nurture that linguistic talent that your child obviously possesses, and it's also the enthusiasm, right? Even more than the talent, that is impressive. I don't think it will be very difficult, given that motivation, intrinsic motivation that the child has, to maintain that and to reinforce all those languages that he's been exposed to. Again, language classes definitely would help, but one thing that might actually help is to find, obviously it is not going to be easy, but children his age that speak those languages so that he can really use them, right? And that would be a nice way of keeping on the one hand, the more formal, the literacy aspect, right? The writing and the reading in those languages, and then the conversing in those languages, which is also important to become proficient, fluent in those. But in general, if the child likes teaching, if he gets texts, if he watches TV, and that helps him as well, definitely encourage him and show what you're doing, which is support that, and obviously you see it as a very good thing. So I really don't think he'll have a problem. From the way you describe him, I think it's pretty clear that he will succeed. But again, the more exposure he gets from different inputs, the better. It would be nice to have children his age, like the old Paul friend, but now online, right? And do Skype or Zoom every weekend for an hour in the language. That would be a nice thing, obviously with a child his age. I'm not sure if there are many of those resources available for children per se online, but since you are a Google person and you're Googling and researching about these things, maybe you can find something along those lines, some child conversation group in a language maybe, or friends across the world, and obviously monitored by parents, caregivers, to ensure that there is not something weird or illegal on the internet or detrimental. But That's what comes to mind, Mariam. But well, congratulations, and keep it up. Definitely, it's definitely going to become a linguist. Be rest assured.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariam, for your insightful question, and well done. Congratulations for being multilingual. And yes, you're one step away from becoming a linguist. Julio, Nobila has a question to ask you.
Hello, firstly, I would like to just say thank you very much. I just like to express my gratitude in being part of this very, very interesting platform discussing multilingualism. I am a multilingual, but I'm a first generation migrant born in the UK. I cannot read or write in my parents' mother tongue language. So I guess my question is, and what I'm curious about is, whether or not you have any key strategies to help me kind of in the first stages of acquiring this language in terms of the written and the written element of it, really. Spoken is fluent, but I don't have any formal literacy skills in reading and writing in my parents' mother tongue. So would you have any strategies to help me in the first steps of acquiring those skills?
So what you mean is that you are multilingual, but then you are kind of illiterate in one of the languages. So
in both of the languages, in both the additional languages, correct?
Oh, yes. I see. So English is clearly your dominant language, certainly
yes,
for anything to do with writing and so on, right?
Yes, correct. Yes.
So sorry, I'm just curious. So you speak two languages of which you don't even know how to spell one word, or
correct? Yes, that is correct. Yes, right.
So clearly that's the oral tradition, and you're
yes, yeah,
kind of
that's right. Yeah,
nice.
I mean, we've never really formally. I'm talking on behalf of me and my siblings. Actually, we've never formally learned the language. It's something we've just acquired through the spoken element of just having conversations from a young age, but we've never actually. Neither of us can actually read and write in the two additional languages that we fluently speak in. So yes.
Well, obviously you do have proper literacy in English, right? And that's already a foundation. Why? Well, because obviously, I don't know the languages or the scripts that they use, but if they use a script that is, for instance, the Roman alphabet, etc., that will make life a bit easier for you. I would probably, I mean, this is going to sound a bit ridiculous at first, but I would probably go for maybe a book for children or something online for children for that language. And because those books tend to be already, they purposefully, try to promote reading and writing from the basics. You see what I mean? And maybe getting one of those would be a good start. So you've never been exposed to any texts or anything in that language online, or?
No, I haven't. No.
See, that's interesting. Do such texts exist in those languages? I mean, they
do. Okay.
Yeah,
I just haven't been exposed to them, and they haven't been a normal part of my upbringing, to say the least. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I would go for something small and then see how your literacy in English kind of transplants to that, because it's an interesting case, right? It happened to me with Asturian a little bit. When I started seeing certain things in writing, I was like taken aback, like, wow, do we really write it like that? So for instance, the indirect object, when you give something to somebody, we say E. But until recently, I didn't know this E was written with a hyphen and a Y. I would have just written an E, right? Like it sounds like we would do in Spanish, for instance.
Sure.
And that was kind of, that was an experience. I remember that was like, wow, a turning point, because I was like, wow, it's written like that. Never did I think about it. So it's amazing. And many people, when I tell them, they are kind of shocked, like, really, do we write it like that? And then obviously people write the way they want ultimately, right? When they are sending a WhatsApp message, because that's not an exam. But yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So So definitely I encourage you to try to find some simple texts, maybe for
Yeah.
children, and see how the foundation, the pillars you got from English kind of, can be extended to those
Sure.
languages, and hopefully that will help. But you have again the motivation. The motivation, I think, is an important first step.
Thank you. That's
And
really
then
helpful. Thank you very much.
And then ideally, if you can find some podcast or something that has a transcription, that will also help, because obviously the oral, and then you will see how that corresponds to the graphemes, to the orthography, and
Sure.
that will, I'm sure it will be easier than you think. But that sounds like an interesting thing to do. I mean, I strongly encourage you to pursue it, Nabila. So
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that piece of advice. Thank you. Thanks.
Lovely.
Thank you very much, Nabila. I'm quite mindful of time, but do we have any more questions here? Any more questions? Right, if you have no more questions, I'm just going to ask my very final question, Julio. It's a very interesting topic. I mean, I could listen to you for the rest of my life. So I'm just going to ask my final question. There is this assumption that your first language, whatever your first language is, always has an influence or interference on your second and foreign languages. So there is this assumption. And based on this assumption, many people say that if you want to learn a second or a foreign language, try to find languages that have the similar or the same grammatical constructions as to your first language. And if you do this, then your life is going to be easy, because you don't have to spend too much time on learning your second language, because it has the same grammatical construction as your first language. But for instance, in our case, in this academy, as you've seen, we have students that are, they're coming from completely different and diverse linguistic backgrounds. Their first language are, Afrikaans or, German or Portuguese and blah, blah, blah. And they're learning Farsi, and Farsi is quite distinct from the languages that we have heard or we have seen. So how would you respond to people that say your first language would always have an interference, positive or negative, on your second language? And based on these, try to find a second language that has the same or similar grammatical construction as your first language.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with you. There's typically that assumption, although I think it varies much more than we think. I have my own meandering example, which is when I hear something in Italian and I understand it. It's funny because Italian and Spanish are similar, but then I always translate it into English, which is shocking, right? Because why would I translate? It's an expression that we have basically verbatim almost in Spanish, but I will give the translation. Oh, does this mean? And I say it in Spanish, but then I say significa, and I say it in English, which is shocking. The thing about whether, for instance, a third language is influenced more by the second or by the first is a topic of heated discussion in the field. That's unfortunately not my field of research. I think it's fascinating, but there's only as much time we have, right? The child needs the 24 hours, so I really cannot delve into those topics. But I think it's definitely an important question and a fascinating one. But I think the similarity between languages can be a double-edged sword. Why? Because the languages may be similar, but clearly they are not identical. And there are a lot of false cognates, what we call false friends, that sometimes are even worse. So this, for instance, Italian and Spanish, it's tough. It's very confusing for learners to try to acquire one or the other. Why? Because the similarities a lot is very high. Unfortunately, there are also huge differences that are kind of subtle. They are hidden behind word structures that are similar, but they are not that similar deep down. And whether learning a language that is structurally or lexicon-wise, vocabulary-wise similar to yours or not, makes it easier is not a simple question, and it's not straightforward. Certain aspects may be acquired right away because they are identical, but others may create more confusion. And the example with Italian is actually particularly the case when it comes to orthography. because Italian spelling is very tough. They have double consonants and things that we don't have in Spanish. And learners of Italian who have Spanish as their mother tongue report going through huge difficulties in that regard. So, you know, I think the question is obviously a very important one, but I don't think it's gonna work exactly the same for everyone. I have friends who've tried to learn Chinese, and they will tell you that Mandarin, spoken bit, is much easier than people would think. The problem is writing, of course, a completely different system of representing words and concepts and so on. So I don't know.
Great, thank you very much, Julio. I think we're gonna have to finish up here. So before we finish it off, in case if anybody has any more questions, Julio, would it be possible for you to share your email address here with the participants? In case if anyone has any more questions, perhaps maybe they can email you and you can get back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
If you Google my name, you'll find my email. That's one option, and the other I can.
Yeah, you can use the chat
it.
box here. The chat box is enabled.
Oh, well, the chat is not working, but I can type it here. No worries. Okay, my current address is this one, Villa Julio, my first last name, and my name dot, sorry, Villa Julio at uniobi.es, which is the University of Oviedo, where I'm working at the moment. .es is because it's Spanish address. Can you all see the screen?
I can see the screen. I'm sure everyone can, yes.
Excellent. So Villa Julio at uniobi.es, but if you're lazy to jot it down now, just put my name and last name on Google and it will show up. No worries. Otherwise, they can always write to you and you can send me the.
Of course. If
forward it or whatever, give them my address. So
yeah, if they want, they can email me or send them to me, and then I can share with Julio. Or you can email Julio directly, and you can share your questions with Julio. So on this note, I think we're going to finish up there. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and yeah, I think we only have Instagram and Facebook, but so my colleagues, you can help me out with this. But don't forget to follow us on Facebook. I think it's Virtual Persian Academy on Facebook and Instagram. Maybe somebody can just write it down here, one of my colleagues, the pages that we have. Right. On this note, I think I just want to thank everyone for getting involved, and thank you everybody for your contributions. I would like to thank Dr. Farzin Rahmani for providing us with the Zoom link. We wouldn't be able to have this webinar if it wasn't for Dr. Rahmani and his Zoom link. I want to thank my colleagues. I want to thank Shahla Khanum for her help and guidance. I want to thank the management team, and in particular Rosa Khanum. And I want to thank every single one of you guys for attending this. As I've said, this is recorded, and the recording is going to be available on www.virtualpersianacademy.co.uk. And finally, a very big thank you, massive thank you to today's distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Julio Villagarcia. Julio, it's very lovely to see you. And it was a very, very interesting talk. And hopefully we're going to invite you back here in near future. And you're going to talk to us about multilingualism and bilingualism in near future. It's been a pleasure to have you. And thank you so very much for spending your time here with us from the sunny Spain. And yeah, so thank you so very much, Julia. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Adios, everybody. Adios. Khuda Hafiz. Adios.
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 Adios, Julia.
Yeah.
خب رکوردینگ رو من قطع کنم دیگه.
بله میتونه قطع کنید.
اسپاتلایت کنم ندارم.
استاپش کن.
بسیارم خوب.